Hey everyone, Sumo Spiffy here. Welcome to the Kyushu 2024 tier list recap. Before we start, if you've been around here for a minute, I used to talk about how I make adjustments at the start of these recaps. There was no reason to do that every time though, so I stopped. In the recap after September, there was some question about why I viewed certain predictions as accurate, even though it seemed like guys weren't living up to expectations. And by guys, I mean the Ozeki. I had them marked as injury tier, and it's been a while since I explained what that means, so it's probably worth going through this a little bit. Essentially, injury tier means I have reason to believe the wrestler is hurt enough to fight noticeably below his normal level of ability, or that he might not get all the way through the tournament. This basho, I only had 4 guys marked injured who fought. That's fewer than usual, but they still give an idea of what I'm looking for to determine if someone is fighting at reduced capacity due to injury. From there, I can decide whether I think they would reach their expected level if healthy, or if, perhaps, their baseline level of ability is less than it used to be. Start with Takayasu. A healthy Papa Bear should dominate the mid-ranks, but he only went 8-7. Did he show signs of injury? Yeah, definitely. The first 7 days were messy. He got drilled out immediately by Ichi Yamamoto and Gonoyama, which is rare when he's fighting at full strength. Even when he won in that first week, he didn't have much drive. He had to retreat and use timing to get Takarafuji going backwards, who he normally dominates, and his other 2 wins were slapdowns. Then he won 5 straight being much more aggressive, which is a switch we've seen flip several times in recent tournaments when his back feels good. What's tricky is that he got those 5 wins against guys who are not his physical equal and or were struggling pretty badly. Like we saw with Kinbozan taking the Juryo Yusho, sometimes an injury that saps your ability can look like it doesn't exist if the competition isn't able to take advantage of it. That leads me towards 2 conclusions. 1, Takayasu was more likely not at full strength at any point, as opposed to recovering halfway through only to fall apart again at the end. 2, however, is that this may be the new normal for him. There will be good days and bad days, and he might pop off if he has a lot of good days during a tournament. But it's hard to argue he's S tier if he's gonna spend some amount of every basho struggling. There's a fair argument A injury tier would have been more accurate, since it's reasonable to say the Takayasu we saw just a couple tournaments ago would have definitely hit 10 wins here, but we'll keep it simple and say he was B tier this time. Hokuto Fuji and Meisei we had at B injury tier. Meisei finished with a winning record, so I'm not gonna overthink it. He looked okay, and thus I'm inclined to think he may just have a lower ceiling now as far as where in the division he can succeed. Hokuto Fuji finished 7-8, but that makes B injury tier feel like a correct prediction given that he had some trouble maneuvering, was clearly in pain after some of his losses, and sometimes didn't put any weight on his foot after a match until he was sure his knee was stable. It could be that this level of injury will be his new normal, such as Takano Sho and his torn ACL, but he hurt his knee at the start of the year. It's still probably too soon to give up some hope of recovery. Finally, Endo was C injury tier, but I think I said if healthy he should be C+. That's pretty much correct. His 7-8 record fits C+, and on top of that, he looked pretty gimpy after some of his matches. Again, this could become the new normal, but since he had a couple recent tournaments where his knees didn't appear to be an issue at all, I think it's more accurate to stay aware of his injury and allow for the possibility of a tournament where it doesn't bother him. And now, for an example of someone we didn't mark as injured but who clearly was, let's look at Kirishima. We know he's recently recovered from issues with his neck, back, and arms, but his 12-3 in September suggested he's now okay. Well, he's not. All we have to do to see the difference is look at his matches against Abi. In September, Abi came in like he always does, hands high, but Kiri deflected it and absorbed the rest of the contact. This time, he got twisted and turned around, but ended up in a position where he was directly facing Abi. When Abi hit him though, he just went back with no ability to withstand. Similarly, against Oho, in September, Kiri attacked and overwhelmed Oho with strikes. This time he took a similar approach but couldn't apply the same force and eventually got off-balanced and lost. I'm not going through all this just to explain the channel's tier list. If that was the case, I'd be so far up my own ass I might become a black hole. I'm covering it because, for all of us, sumo wrestlers can be difficult to figure out when they might be hurt but never let on. If you want to see clearly where these guys are at, and oh boy am I still figuring that out, one thing that helps a lot is seeing when a guy isn't doing what he usually likes to do versus when he's doing the same thing as usual but it suddenly isn't working. The first one is pretty easy to notice. Mitake Yumi from this tournament is a good example. He hurt his shoulder pretty badly, refused to drop out, and couldn't fight normally for a couple of days. The second is harder to spot, but Mitake Yumi's a good example of that too. He eventually started looking more like himself and even won a couple fights. However, if you just started tuning in then and weren't aware of the injury or his normal level of effectiveness, you might think he's just not that good as opposed to injured and unable to fight to his potential. It's all a learning experience, and trust when I say we are all learning together. Okay, let's get into the recap proper. Of course, let's start with the heroes of the day. Kotozakura had him A tier because that's the level of performance he's shown for the last year and a half, but a 14-1 Yusho is as S tier as it gets. Hoshoryu's a little more interesting. This tier list used to be for fantasy, but since performance is based on wins regardless of whether you play fantasy games, I stopped calling it that. This is a rare case where the difference kinda matters. In fantasy, S tier is pick this guy every time you can, and a lot of games force you to choose only one Ozeki. Kotozakura was the one this time, which theoretically makes Hoshoryu slide to A tier. But going 13-2 and taking it to the last day, only to be beaten by someone on an even bigger roll, is obviously an S tier performance, and that's what we're calling this. As for the expected high flyers, Takerufuji and Onosato did well enough, they just didn't stomp quite as many faces as expected. Takerufuji hit 10 wins despite a stunning loss to Toki Hayate and losses to 4 guys he beat in their first meetings, so he's still at least A tier. Onosato, though, drops to B tier. Really, part of the reason I didn't expect the Ozeki curse or hangover or whatever is that he only went 9-6 after his first Yusho in May. I figured he would avoid whatever threw him off in July. Maybe he did, and this time it was something completely different, but regardless of the reason, he slipped here. I expect him to be more in form in January. However, it's worth noting that of his 6 losses, only Daisho beat him for the first time head-to-head. If Hoshoryu and Kotozakura actually start going 11+ wins consistently, then combine that with Wakataka Kage obviously having a good vibe on how to beat him, and Onosato may not be on the super short trip to Yokozuna it looked like after September. Next up, the other winning Sanyaku, Daisho, and Wakamoto Haru. These guys showed exactly why I placed them in high C+. Daisho went 8-7 for the 3rd straight tournament and had his 8th win on day 14 with a solid win over Takano Sho, but he also lost to massively struggling Churano Umi. Wakamoto Haru had 10 wins, so we'll move him to B tier, but he's a guy who wins when he's supposed to and benefits from a good schedule. He's clearly figured something out against Abi, and this version of Kirishima wasn't a challenge, but other than that, he once again lost to everyone he normally struggles with. So yeah, he'll continue to be a very good candidate for a winning record with the possibility of the wrong guy showing up on his card and tanking his basho. And you know what? Let's stay on the winning track with everyone who stonked out down in Maegashira to hit A tier. I called Abi high C+ because he hasn't had a losing record at any Maegashira rank since 2020 before his suspension, but the only time he's gone double digits since his Yusho in 2022 was this past May, and that was carried by 2 Fusen wins. B tier is me viewing a guy as locked in for a winning record, and he just rides too thin a line sometimes to be comfortable with that. But this basho, he did full-on Abi things, which included winning by some type of throw for only the 11th time in an 11.5-year career. And he did it against Onosato of all people. For a guy where you know exactly what he's gonna do, you never really know what's gonna happen. Likewise, although I had him lower down, Takano Sho and Gonoyama were C+ because they were in positions where they should do well, but gave good reasons not to trust they necessarily would. In Takano Sho's case, I think it's probably time to stop looking at his knee as a potential issue. He is who he is, and blasting the world for the 2nd straight time at Maegashira 6 basically says we should expect quality from him when he's not lined up against the whole Sanyaku. I still don't trust Gonoyama's tactics, and I almost demoted him just for getting hanked by Endo for the 2nd straight tournament. You're not supposed to let guys do that to you in consecutive matches. But for the most part, he was under control, and while I'm still hesitant to believe he'll be able to replicate this against tougher competition that requires greater effort, it was good to see he's at least capable of not diving past everyone in sight. And then we have Chiyo Shoma. What the actual f happened here? Now look, a lot of people poke fun at Chiyo for being the Henka King. That's what I like about him. But nobody outside of the Marvel universe could have seen this coming. One way you can see if a guy overperformed is by looking at how many wins he had against opponents where he's still losing the head-to-head. Most wrestlers will have at most a couple of these per tournament unless they figured something out and are making up ground, like Wakamoto Haru against Abi. Chiyo had 4. Not only that, they all came in the last 7 days, and 3 were against opponents where the head-to-head still isn't close, so he was on some kind of roll. However, before we get too hyped about his prospects, 2 of those guys, Hokuto Fuji and Takayasu, were among the 4 guys we had injury concerns about going in. The last, Ura, might have just been tired after getting beat up all tournament. But frankly, it's full-on horseshit that Chiyo didn't earn a special prize because he's probably never gonna do this again. Now let's work through the tiers. Wakataka Kage, B tier, nailed it. I don't know if he's genuinely better than he was before his knee injury, or if he's benefiting from slightly fewer tough opponents hanging around, but the only real blemish on his record was a loss to Oshoma. The schedule could have been a bit tougher, especially when he caught Ura on day 14, despite the 2 of them having such wildly disparate tournaments, but he did work and he'll be a Komusubi again in January. C+ good picks. Let's start with Atami Fuji. Going into day 15 at 7-7 is about as C tier as it gets, and he performed exactly as the breakdown suggested he would. He had his moment of lost focus against Hoshoryu, overstepping when he had the match won, but largely succeeded through the heightened aggression his sumo has needed. His losses came from expected sources, but if he can keep this up when he starts with Sanyaku matches rather than piling up wins against Maegashira opponents first, maybe that Komusubi slot will come sooner rather than later. Tamawashi was 8-7 as well, although his 8 wins were locked up on day 13. He managed to follow that up with a truly baffling loss to Bushozan, which, Then Takeru Fuji came calling, but the old man's sticking around and should just jump back into the single-digit ranks in January. Tobizaru, like I said, he wasn't a total gimme pick because he'd have a heavy Sanyaku schedule. He faced 5 Sanyaku opponents and only beat Shodai, so those concerns were warranted. Add Atami Fuji to the mix, who he's 0-6 against, and success required beating just about everyone else he faced. But he did exactly that. And then Onokatsu. This one felt good. He fought the way he showed he was capable of in Juryo and started 6-0 against guys that his style should be able to beat. That put him in the crosshairs of much tougher competition, and again, as expected, he didn't hold up nearly as well once that happened. But you gotta appreciate that he beat Abi by going straight after him, and being able to bull through those hands in a basho where Abi was on a major roll should be a good sign for his success going forward. Of course, when some guys stonk, other guys sink. I said I was back on the Oho bandwagon, but I got on just in time to see Oho's limitations reappear and slide him to C-. He was Koto Zakura's only loss, which was impressive, but all his other wins were the ones he should have gotten under the circumstances. Likewise, apart from Oshoma, none of his losses were all that surprising. Until we see a clear elevation in his game, I think this'll be what we should expect from him. Some expected wins, but not a lot of positive records at these high ranks unless he pulls off some surprises. Hiroda-Umi, obviously D tier as hell when he starts 1-11. I can't fall back on the idea he was injured because even though he's obviously lost some pop, there's no indication as to why, and it's absolutely possible he's starting to suffer the Enho effect. Once opponents know what a smaller dude wants to do, he has far fewer ways to overcome them. He's still so aggressive that he may make some noise with an easier schedule next basho, but if he can't, that Enho effect becomes much more likely as a cause. Sadanoumi seems like a good guy, so I feel for him dropping to Juryo, but if I have to sacrifice Sadanoumi to also get rid of Ryuden, I'll take that deal 8 days a week. Now for the wrestlers we had somewhat less faith in. Matakeumi finishing 7-8, losing a Darwin match on day 15 is very fitting for a high C- pick, but there's still an asterisk here with his shoulder injury. If you missed it, he took a hard fall on day 6 and got stretchered off, but for some ungodly reason didn't miss a single day even though he basically couldn't function for the next 3 days. He must have felt halfway decent since he started being more aggressive after that and pulled a couple wins, but it still looked absolutely insane not to sit out a single match. Hopefully he's fully recovered by January so we can see what he does at likely the same rank. Midori Fuji. Like I said with Hiroda-Umi, the Enho effect is real. He's still quick and clever and tough and should hang at these levels for a while yet, but these mid-ranks are probably his new home. Roga should be proud of his 7-8 at a career-high rank, but from a fan perspective, let's be clear-eyed about this. His wins came against a much smaller guy, 3 struggling veterans, 2 opponents he tends to thrash, and a Koto Shoujo who was absolutely Koto Shoujoing. This was really a best-case scenario. January will again depend on who's around him, but it could go a lot worse. On the winning side of C-, Ichi Yamamoto started off quite well, reaching 3-0 and then 7-4 before taking a couple of somewhat surprising losses to Nishikigi and Toki Hayate. He hit Kachikoshi with a win over Sadanoumi on day 15, and if the Banzuke plays out as expected, that 8th win is going to give him a big rank bump. And it's probably going to end up with him repeatedly greeting fans in the 6th row. But hey, enjoy his probable career high rank, Ichi fans. Takara Fuji got on a mega roll, going from 0-2 to 7-2, and I thought he was about to make my doubts look unbelievably stupid. But then he maybe got surprised by a rejuvenated Mitakeumi, his schedule ramped up, and he had to slide in a win over Endo to reach 8. So, although he exceeded expectations a bit, the prediction of him going all crafty old man and not overdoing it once he was safe did appear accurate. In the barely hanging on part of C-, we have the two guys we predicted to barely hang on. Hooray! Nishiki Fuji got big clapped off the start against what turned out to be some of the toughest competition he'd face, then squeaked out a decent basho from there. Even dropping day 15 to Endo in a battle of losing and losing-er should keep him in the division, which means he's officially on his Shimano Umi arc. Toki Hayate, hey, I said he'd have a losing record, but not so losing he dropped to Juryo, and bang, he's almost certainly landing at 17 West in January. And he won't even have to face Takara Fuji's vengeance. Probably. Ura, sadly, drops to D tier on account of his first ever loss to Chiyoshima, leaving him with only 5 wins. The only upside is that he should be no higher than 4 West in January, which still means some Sanyaku fights, but at least not all of them. This pleases us, since he fought hard this basho and was simply overmatched too often. Shodai, on the other hand, went full clown fiesta, hitting such a complete mental boom that he lost to Churinaumi and Oshoma on the last 2 days of the tournament. Those are the kinds of fights that, if he had them the first 2 days, he'd probably win and might spin that momentum into a 10-5 record or something. The Dark Lord of Chaos remains our ever-present foe. Oh, and Kota Shoho was full on D tier before he hurt his foot, so there's that. And the D tier predictions. Nailed these 100%. Much like in Fantasy Sumo, I am the king of suck. Churinaumi and Oshoma did as expected at career high ranks in the Joy, which was lose a whole bunch. Shishi and Asakoryu did as expected at career high ranks in a new division, which was lose a whole bunch, although Asakoryu at least got the wins he should have gotten, plus a nice finisher against Meisei on day 15. Anyone who thought Shishi might have a chance after his 2-0 start though, yeah, you'll learn. And Bushozan was pretty much toast before he had to sit with foot, ass, and knee disease or whatever he had. But hey, he was out 4 days and still managed 8 non-Kyujo losses on his record, which is its own kind of impressive. As for the Who Knows picks, incredibly, they did exactly as expected. Nishikigi wasn't in a position to make a run at anything, so when the basho started poorly, he roused himself just enough to keep from being a complete embarrassment, but otherwise took a vacation. And Shonen Umi breezed his way to a winning record down in the dregs of the division before running into a trio of opponents he's not that great against. Still, even in a more lively state, Takayumi was still obviously hurt by the end, and losing that match was sad. I don't know if Shon is sick of speedrunning trash records further up the division, but hey, he won't have to worry about that in January at least. Alright, that's the final tier list recap of 2024 over and done. I'm contemplating some fun stuff in the coming days, time permitting, but we'll see how that goes. For now, I'll put out an early reminder that the Guess the Banzuke deadline for the next basho is Monday, December 16th. You can find the link to the entry form on our Banzuke videos, or hey, check out sumospiffy.com and head to the fantasy section. You'll find not only Guess the Banzuke, but a whole collection of links to other fantasy games there. Other than that, have a great day, and I'll see you soon.